I'd like to start by saying our dogs are broken. 1 in 3 dogs will be diagnosed with cancer every year. It's around 6 million dogs a year in the United States. About 60% of dogs in the US are overweight or obese. And if we're being honest, that's a relatively conservative number. Diabetes is also on the rise. None of this is good. The outlook is horrible for our dogs. So, what's the solution and what exactly is causing these problems? Hey guys, I'm Kyle from Raw Canine Experiment, and today we are going to be talking about why a high fat, moderate protein, low carbohydrate diet is important for your dog's metabolic health. So, let's establish a baseline. There was a study completed that aimed to see what macronutrient preferences dogs would have if they were allowed to self select their foods. So, these dogs were given the option of a high fat, high protein, and high carbohydrate diet. They were allowed to eat ad lib as much as they want, whenever they wanted. The findings of this study were that dogs displayed a preference for diets with higher protein content, followed by fat and relatively lower carbohydrate intake. Well, specifically, it's actually a lot more interesting than that. Dogs, for about the first 8 days, hyper selected the high fat diet. And then they started to wean down and slowly select more protein. Eventually, towards the end of the 10th day, which is when the study was completed, dogs ended up with about a 1-to-1 fat to protein ratio. The exact numbers were about 52% fat and 44% protein, so still higher on the fat side, but about 1-to-1. Now, the very interesting part about this study is that these were carbohydrate fed dogs. These dogs were raised on dry food, yet their carb consumption never increased above 4% throughout the study. And matter of fact, there's a chart that shows from the study that these dogs actually approached the carbohydrate heavy diet first, yet they did not eat it. The majority approached it and then left for either the high fat or high protein diet. So that is our baseline. Dogs, ideally, when allowed to feed on whatever they want, will select a 1-to-1 fat to protein ratio. As a final note on that study, it had also concluded that dogs have an innate ability to self-select diets that align with their macronutrient requirements with a clear preference for protein-rich foods. This behavior is consistent with their evolutionary adaptations as carnivorous scavenging mammals. So take that, first of all, anybody who says that your dog doesn't know what they're eating and does not know how to select their own food. They, in fact, do. The problem is that we are feeding them a food that is very high in carbohydrates. Now, the question becomes, as it relates to disease, why are carbohydrates such a problem for our dogs? Well, the first thing is that they're not species appropriate. Your dog in the wild, dogs in the wild, unless they're in a very poor country, will not be out there searching for wheat, barley, beet pulp, or rice. The food that we are putting in kibble, these high carbohydrate foods, are typically the end result of the human food industry. It is the waste of the human food industry, and kibble companies are allowed to buy these foods for very, very low amounts of money, so they use them as fillers and binders in your dog's kibble. When these kibble companies include all of these carbohydrates in your dog's food, they do not have your dog's metabolic health in mind. They have their bottom line in mind. If they had your dog's metabolic health in mind, if we're being honest here, they would be putting more fat and more protein and less carbohydrates in your dog's food, because all of the studies show that dogs do better on a high fat, high protein, low carbohydrate food. So again, the reason they are doing this is as a filler and a binder and to increase their profits. Fat is a very valuable resource, which again is why dogs hyper selected it in that free feeding trial. If dogs didn't need fat, they wouldn't have selected it, but they selected it for a purpose. It is one of the most efficient energy sources you can give to your dog. It is the most valuable energy source you can give to your dog, and it is also the one that supports their metabolic health the best. So we need to transform our dogs from animals that are eating a very high carbohydrate diet to animals that are eating a high fat, moderate protein, low carbohydrate diet. And of course, this is not to say that all carbohydrates are bad. I do like a little veg in my dog's diet. I do like throwing in some berries as a treat every once in a while. These are beneficial additions, but not in very high quantities. That is what needs to be understood here. As your dog eats more carbohydrates, especially the cereal grains that we mentioned before, their blood sugar spikes, their insulin also spikes, all of that sugar is getting stuffed into the fat cells, and your dog is becoming fatter. So that leads me to one of the biggest misconceptions about feeding dogs a high-fat diet. People tend to believe that feeding their dogs a high-fat diet is going to make them fat. This is not true. What actually happens is you take your dog and you feed them a high-fat diet, and their body is then burning fat and turning it into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. This is efficient. This is metabolically appropriate. This is species appropriate, right? As your dog is burning fat, they are losing excess weight, and they are using their most optimal source of fuel. This is what we should be feeding our dogs. Also, let's just think logically about this for a second. Most dogs in the United States are fed a relatively plant-based diet, if we're being honest. And people don't really think about that because they go, well, the bag of kibble that I bought my dog has a steak and a lamb or a bison on it, whatever it may be. But those foods are not really in your dog's kibble. Studies have shown that the protein that is in kibble, and especially in puppy foods, are not nearly as bioavailable as we would like to believe that they are. What's actually the bioavailable source of energy in kibble is carbohydrates. Now, dogs are efficient at digesting carbohydrates, but as we know, carbohydrates fuel metabolic disease, especially when fed in mass. So, dogs, again, are eating a plant based diet, and look at the state of them. They are unhealthier than ever before. Metabolic disease rates are skyrocketing. So many are obese, so many have joint issues, which is a source of inflammation. So many have diabetes. Cancer rates, again, are skyrocketing. So, this idea that if we keep feeding our dogs carbohydrates in a low-fat diet, that they're going to get healthier is completely incorrect. Now, when we talk about optimal fats for your dog, I have to mention that I am not talking about throwing a bunch of olive oil or whatever it may be, or peanut butter in your dog's food. That is not what I'm referencing. What I'm referencing is species-appropriate fats. This would be fattier cuts of meat. This would be sardines. This would be raw meaty bones that have chunks of fat hanging off of them that you are not going to cut off, right? Or in the case of Bones & Co., their proprietary 1-to-1 fat to protein ratio formula. The amazing thing about Bones & Co.'s formula as well is that it is made up of 95% meat, bone, and organ, and then the last 5% is vegetables and some vitamins. And you'll also find that they are not using a large load of synthetic vitamins and minerals in their food like many other raw feeding companies are doing nowadays. Also, the vegetables that you will find in their food, along with the other carbohydrates, still make up less than 1% net carbs in the diet. This is extremely important, and it is species appropriate. Again, it is metabolically appropriate. These are the things that you are looking for when you are looking to feed your dog a commercially raw food item. So just to summarize, the idea of feeding your dog a high-fat, moderate-protein, low-carbohydrate diet is to get them in a state called ketosis, where their body is using fat as fuel rather than carbohydrates. This is the optimal metabolic state for your dog that will help prevent and mitigate disease. If you're going to take away anything from this video, it really should be these three things: that carbohydrates are not essential for your dog should be using fat as fuel, and using fat as fuel with moderate protein and low carbohydrates in a complete and balanced diet is going to help your dog stay metabolically fit and prevent the onset of further metabolic disease. Well, guys, like I said, I just wanted to make a quick video about why you should be feeding your dog a species and metabolically appropriate, high fat, moderate protein, low carbohydrate diet to keep your dog metabolically fit. If you want to learn more about your dog's health and how to better take care of them like you would yourself, you can find me on Instagram at Raw Canine Experiment or on YouTube, where I'll be posting more content like this. Take care.